Microsoft was over here trying to walk into the living room wearing a suit. I mean, Sony had a complete lock on the culture. Sega had just burned itself to the ground. And here was Microsoft showing up with this massive black box looking like somebody weaponized the VCR.
Which was intentional, really. I mean, the Xbox had PC blood. It had an internal hard drive. It had a staggering amount of raw processing power. Raw processing power doesn't really stick to your ribs, though.
The console launched in November of 2001 into a market that owed Microsoft zero affection. I mean, they were the Windows company, the people who made the animated paperclip. And here they were asking for permanent space under the television. That required a massive cultural justification. Halo became that justification. You didn't just buy an Xbox and eventually notice the game. Halo was the entire explanation why the hardware was allowed in your house in the first place. I mean, the controller was like holding a loaf of bread and the branding screamed focus test corporate edge. But then the escape pod opened and the machine suddenly mattered. I mean, if you think about it, launch titles usually just prove that the disk drive works. Here was Halo anchoring an entire system. Critics broke out the heavy vocabulary for it, tossing around words like killer app and system seller. The market pushed about 5 million copies on an install base of around 24 million. That's a ridiculous amount of heavy lifting for one green helmet to carry. Microsoft sold the Xbox as the definitive future of tech, and Halo made it work because it gave that future a physical address. Xbox had just spent months basically just asking for permission just to exist, and Chief presented a very strong case. The crazy part about all this is that the code itself barely survived its own development. Halo's origin story is pure undocumented chaos. I mean, back before it meant LAN parties and someone screaming about a pistol from across the room, Bungie was actually building something else entirely. Yeah, I mean, Halo started as a strategy game for the Mac. You were supposed to just command troops from the sky, but to test the physics engine, the team built this futuristic Jeep. Then they realized how cool it was to attach a camera directly to that Jeep. The Warthog had this bizarre gravity to it, and the developers essentially stopped working on the strategy game so they could drive the Jeep all over the test map.
Which is just an incredibly Bungie way to make history, right? They accidentally built this fun Jeep, and then the physics engine starts making non-negotiable demands on the entire project.
So the camera came down into third-person view. I mean, back in '99, Steve Jobs even showed this version of Halo on a macro stage running on Apple hardware. Microsoft then bought the studio in 2000. The platform shifted to Xbox. They pushed the camera all the way into first person, and suddenly Bungie was financially responsible for the justification of a massive console launch. Playing it today, the design feels like it was carved in stone. I mean, you have the 2-weapon limit, you have the rechargeable shields. It feels incredibly intentional. You naturally assume it was always destined to be this masterpiece. You know, the final product breathes like the team had years to carefully arrange everything. They absolutely did not. Jason Jones later described the final stretch as a cathedral self-assembling out of a hurricane, which is an interesting way to describe it. The art and the combat code were basically smashed together so fast that the developer could barely explain the structural integrity. Yeah, one of gaming's most sacred sci-fi artifacts crawled out of an internal project folder called Monkey Nuts. And yet, that somehow feels spiritually accurate to early 2000 tech. I mean, November 15th was coming. The calendar doesn't care whether the code is stable or not. They hacked it apart, rebuilt it, and probably panicked all the way to the finish line. But yet somehow that chaos stayed hidden in the walls because once the pod doors ejected, the panic goes completely invisible. All you get is the grass and that impossibly curved metal above your head. That first drop onto the ring is quiet in a way that modern shooters completely forget how to do. I mean, you can hear the gunfire off in the distance. The Covenant dropships are kind of moving around. Emotionally, though, the game hands you a physical space long before it hands you an objective. You know, you step into the daylight. There's actually room to look around. Your brain immediately files that sensation somewhere permanent. Shooters before 2001 shoved you down a gray corridor. They relied heavily on tight areas, you know, walls tight enough to make the environment feel like a weaponized storage unit. Halo opens the second mission with a strange mathematical risk. It lets the geometry breathe. The valley is wide enough to trigger a genuine sense of discovery. The game never bothers telling you that the environment is huge. It just lets you stand directly underneath the proof.
There were no radio towers to climb, no map icons. I mean, Halo gave you this illusion of total freedom while keeping that invisible hand firmly on the back of your neck. The valley feels
open, but never loose. You cross the terrain, but the Covenant encounters remain perfectly readable. You learn the topography naturally without staring at a minimap. And once you get into the Warthog, it accelerates all of this. The second you get behind the wheel, the temperature of the game changes. The ring stops acting like a painted background and becomes this physical location you actually have to travel across.
There I was, violently wrestling with this futuristic Jeep driving across alien grass while my buddy was yelling at me for flipping it into the ditch again. But, in my defense, this thing handled exactly like a couch with a military budget. That first landing stayed lodged into people's heads because the battlefield itself felt like this active archaeological site. The game seemed to genuinely outgrow the physical television screen. You were still sitting there on your floor holding the controller, but just for a few seconds, the room lost the argument and the ring won. Bungie's Skybox is doing a staggering amount of heavy lifting here. You look up and the structure climbs over the horizon, folding the universe into this piece of architecture. That single visual establishes the stakes well before the dialogue even tries. It's been here long enough to stop caring about who's currently bleeding on it. No one has to tell you you're small. The sky already did. The Marines beside you feel incredibly temporary. Even Cortana's voice sounds tiny underneath the sky. The grass looks aggressively peaceful, which makes the human wreckage feel almost rude. It's like you crashed your dropship on a cathedral and started tracking mud across the altar. The game gives you this massive, quiet breath of air and holds that delicate middle ground just long enough for the awe to settle into your hand. Then the Covenant patrols show up, and the engine has to prove that those mechanics hold up under heavy fire. Before Halo, console shooters had a serious thumb problem. PC players had the mouse and the whole desk of tactical advantages. Console players had some plastic sticks and raw hope, and a quiet understanding that aiming at anything smaller than a barn door would trigger some moral crisis. To fix that, your hands have to completely forget they're holding a plastic brick. Obvious ideas usually stay hidden until somebody bleeds all over the prototype, right? Left stick moves, right stick looks. You take a hit, the code gives you 3 seconds to recover, just enough time to get brave again. You don't need a tutorial to understand a blinking light. The code lets you make a mistake without immediately turning that mistake into paperwork. I just remember the physical weight of it all. The way the plasma grenades bounced off the walls predictably, the way the elites physically dove out of the way of my terrible aim. The enemies felt like they were actually trying to survive me, which was pretty cool. Jamie Griesmer famously called it 30 seconds of fun repeated over and over. An encounter breaks out, you scramble a few seconds later, the fight has changed completely. Building that loop is excruciatingly difficult. The 2-weapon limit forced the issue. You couldn't carry a hardware store in your spine anymore. You picked up a shotgun or, your plasma pistol, and you live with your choices. One of those choices was basically a sniper rifle pretending to be a handgun. That pistol had absolutely no business being that confident. It all happens absurdly fast. The grenade detonates on a strict readable timer. The shield lets you risk a deeply stupid push, hide behind a rock, and pretend that the whole sequence had been a deliberate strategy. The aim assist stays completely quiet. It keeps the grunts in sight so smoothly, you genuinely believe it's natural. The game consistently bails you out and has the absolute decency to never brag about it. The enemies actually responded to the physical space. Grunts panicked when their leader dropped. Elites took cover. You kept listening to the battlefield because the battlefield kept talking back. You learned to read the danger shifting in real time. Surviving a catastrophic decision felt like tactical genius. The campaign spent hours isolating you, and then somebody dragged the heavy television downstairs and hijacked the quiet code for a house party. Everybody remembers the room, right? Someone's basement, a friend's house where the carpet had seen things no carpet should ever discuss. Halo arrived long before Xbox Live turned multiplayer into a sterile menu. If you wanted a massive 16-player experience, you had to do the physical work. Big CRTs with the approximate density of a dying star had to be hauled downstairs. Then came the tangle of the Ethernet cables and the brutal negotiation of who was sitting on the floor. A Halo LAN party required some serious logistics. You had to build the event with your bare hands. GoldenEye and Perfect Dark built the couch ritual, but Halo added a heavier physics to it. Matchmaking turned into this chaotic experience that nobody had actually approved. Twitch aim only really gets you so far. Rocket hits the Warthog wrong, suddenly your whole strategy goes to shit, and the whole room actually ends up reacting to an accident that nobody planned. The game just kept generating accidents, some of them useful, most of them loud, someone yelling about screen looking, your friends over here driving a Jeep like they completely forgot how gravity works. System Link wired 4 consoles together. Blood Gulch is the map that everybody remembers, right? The 2 bases across from each other in a dirt canyon. Walking through the middle of that was like a
heavy tax on optimism. If you lined up the perfect escape, with the flag carrier panicking in the back, one stray rocket would turn the entire vehicle into a tumbling disaster. Driving the Warthog alone probably caused more screaming matches than most minor wars. Split-screen co-op brought a completely different kind of noise. Moving through the campaign with another person meant dealing with their terrible grenade choices in real time. People literally carried this game through dorm rooms and lunch tables. For a lot of people, this game became the blue glow of a TV after midnight. The moment a match ended, absolutely nobody wanted to go home yet. The campaign had a completely different memory weighting though. The game spent hours making you trust the open beauty of the ring. But then a door opens somewhere deep inside the installation and something comes out wrong. By the time the flood appears, you already understand the rhythm. You know exactly how the elites dodge. The grunts are a loud little survival problem. You have a system. The engine then just feeds that entire system into a wood chipper. Halo makes you fall in love with the geometry right before telling you that geometry is in fact a graveyard. You get used to the ancient metal, the impossible curve overhead. Then suddenly everything starts getting incredibly wet. Bodies start bending in ways that joints really shouldn't bend. I remember the first time it happened, it made me feel like the disc itself caught a virus, like the game got physically ill while I was playing it. The game basically switched genres mid-game. Like somebody just forgot to explain the lockdown procedures of this quarantine zone. Firefights used to make sense. Break shield, move up. The flood just keeps piling bodies onto you until there's absolutely no room left to think. The wide open terrain that you used to love before just turns into a liability.
And don't get me started on the library. That place is an agonizingly filled, repetitive filing cabinet built by a civilization with absolutely zero respect for mental health. The campaign drags into pure exhaustion, like the rot was sealed underneath the floorboards the entire time. The corridors start narrowing down, the bodies simply don't stop coming. The architecture itself starts feeling physically sick. Those massive, empty stretches of the map now feel completely abandoned, like the whole installation was just holding its breath, waiting for something stupid enough to open the wrong door. The game completely stops caring about your armor. You're just really trying to find a way to escape. The awkward question sitting underneath the hardware launch was, kind of obvious. Why buy this giant box? Back then, serious shooters still lived on a desk. Quake, Unreal Tournament, those were the gold standards. The couch versions usually came with a massive asterisk. The assumption was that you simply couldn't do a real sandbox content on a television, and you certainly couldn't do it with dual analog sticks. Then the reviews dropped. Edge magazine, for instance, gave it a 10 out of 10, which is a score that they historically guarded like a state secret. It was usually reserved for Nintendo-level magic. The score wasn't only writing the graphics either. Edge noticed the part that really mattered, that fights kept breaking out in these weird, unscripted little ways. Reviewers were genuinely shocked that the vehicles didn't break the physics engine. For once a console shooter had real distance in it. The game sold fast enough to permanently fuse it with the Xbox brand. But people still talk about the first drop onto the ring like they're recalling a deeply personal vacation they took inside the machine. The standard gaming history is incredibly hollow here. The industry just files the game under a highly successful launch title and completely walks away. They throw around corporate buzzwords like killer app. Those words are completely useless to anybody who was actually sitting in that room. The engine just hijacked our nervous system and made us believe that the valley was a physical address we could actually drive to. Revisiting the game is easy enough. You're just playing with a fully mapped understanding of the layout. Going back always carries just a little bit of ache for me because you boot up the old code today and you already know the entire layout. You know exactly how the Warthog handles. You know exactly what's waiting for you down in the swamp. You're just ultimately trying to reach for a version of yourself who had absolutely no idea what was behind the pod door. No matter how many times the industry updates the textures, the memory just keeps pulling you back to that original crash site. When I think about this game, it always starts with the door for me. That's that dry metallic hiss right before the metal blows off. You step out past the smoking wreckage and you actually just look up into the sky. I remember sitting there on the floor and then the game just suddenly felt physically larger than my living room. The ring is just this curved thing over the horizon, completely calm, like the architecture has just been waiting there for thousands of years before I even picked up the controller.
I mean, that was the first drop. The engine just kind of hands you grass and daylight. And for one incredibly quiet second standing there under the impossible structure, it felt genuinely like I was the only person on Earth awake enough to actually see it.